Hey everybody, I am Ryan Doyle, this is Dolly, and this is the Verdigris Table, where we teach you how to play Dungeons & Dragons, how to become a better player, and eventually how to take your turn behind the Dungeon Master's screen. Today we are talking about magic. I cast Find Familiar and get a little fake chihuahua. Magic in D&D is just a little bit complicated, and I think that's a feature, not a bug. It feels right that there's a little more complexity to spellcasting than, say, like hucking a spear at the enemy. And I'm not trying to scare you off. By the end of this video, you're going to have a very solid groundwork of the universal basics on the D&D system of magic. You should just know, as a new player going into it, that rolling up a caster, a character that relies primarily on magic, is going to require a little more effort, is going to be a little more decision-making and a little more resource management-y, and just a little more crunchy. There's going to be a little more work to do. Now, that work pays off. I definitely enjoy playing casters for sure, but if you're not looking for that level of complexity, especially whatever, your first time sitting down at a table, then maybe don't go caster or don't go full caster. But if you're going to go full caster or half caster or take a martial class with a subclass that's more magic based, or simply you're going to take a feat that gives you a little bit of spell casting, then this is your video. Now, to further add to that complexity, every class that's going to have its own source of magic, like thematically, be it a higher power or a higher ideal or a deep connection with nature or simply study or grandpa was a dragon or I'm really good at music. There's a lot of different ways to do magic in Dungeons & Dragons, and depending on your class and very well maybe even your subclass, magic is going to operate differently, be it what spells you can choose from, however many you can have known or prepared, how often you get your resources back, be it on a short rest or a long rest. There's a lot of nuance that's going to come down to the class level. If you're really interested in that, if there's a particular kind of character that you're rolling up, then I would recommend checking out my series of character creation videos, because every class that has magic, I'm going to talk about their magic, whatever specifications. But today in this video, we are going to be focused on like the universal building blocks, what everyone who's playing a caster is going to need to know. To get those specifics for whatever class, subclass you're rolling up, the Player's Handbook is a great place to start. I'm putting a link down below to my affiliate link. Otherwise, the basic rules that I've been sharing are actually pretty light on classes and on spells, actually. So link down below is the system reference document. It's a little chunkier, clunkier, but also a free, easily accessible resource that's going to give you way more options. So yeah, link to that down below as well. And in the very beginning of your class, you're going to have a chart that's going to tell you a lot, and depending on what you're rolling up, further down in the description, it's going to spell out exactly what you need to know for the specific kind of character you are rolling up. So for the most part, if a character is going to do magic, then they are casting a spell. A spell is like a unit of magic, and spells have different levels to them. So you can have a level 0 spell, we call that a cantrip, all the way up to level 9, which is the big history-shaping, world-changing, game-breaking spells. So a spell's level is telling you roughly how powerful it is. It's also letting you know what spell slot level you're going to need in order to cast that spell. Spell slots are a lot like mana in other games, other systems. It's not quite a perfect translation, but a spell slot is the energy it takes to cast a spell, the power, the mojo, the juice that gets spent in order to do magic. The Player's Handbook describes spell slots as like grooves. I always think of them as like tubular. For whatever reason, that's what my brain does. They come in different gauges. So a 3rd level spell isn't going to fit into a 2nd level spell slot. To cast a third level spell, you need a third level spell slot or higher. A level 3 spell will fit into a level 4 spell slot. And sometimes, depending on what the spell is, it'll actually expand to fill it, and that's called upcasting. So you're putting more juice into that level 3 spell. Depending on what kind of character I am, these spell slots are going to be re-upped every time I take a short rest or maybe a long rest. And I have a fixed amount of spell slots at whatever level. And again, that's all covered under my class. There are also level 0 spells, as I mentioned, those cantrips. And they do not take up a spell slot when you cast them. They're basically easy enough to do that you can do them all day, essentially. Now, cantrips obviously are not going to be as powerful as like level 1 spells, let alone level 5, 7, 8, 9 spells. But don't sleep on cantrips because of their ability to not take up slots. You can keep doing them all day. Good cantrips are going to serve you very well. And cantrips might actually be, depending on what you're rolling up, might be the primary kind of magic you're doing. In the next video, we're going to talk about just the basic principles of spell selection. But for now, just keep in mind that a good cantrip is going to take you very far. Now, perhaps confusingly, your character level is not a one-to-one ratio with like the spell slot levels, the spells that you can use. At level 5, you don't have access to level 5 spells. I mean, maybe through a scroll or a magic item or whatever, but your character won't have a spell slot for 5th level until maybe level 9 or even level 17, depending on what your class is. So again, you gotta look at the book or the SRD, you gotta pull up the chart for your class. For this video, we're going to pop up the sorcerer's chart so you can get a better sense of what I'm talking about here. All right, so everything is spelled out on this chart. We can take a look at first level, for instance, and our sorcerer is going to know 4 cantrips and 2 spells level 1 or above. So at first level, we're going to go to the sorcerer spell list. Every class is going to have their own list of spells available to them, and we're going to choose 4 cantrips. And we're also going to pick out 2 level 1 spells. Without having a second level spell slot, we are not allowed to know any level 2 spells. They wouldn't do us any good even if we did, so we're going to pick out 2 level 1 spells. And here's an important note. If we know spell A and spell B, and we have 2 spell slots, we can cast A twice, we can cast B twice, we can cast A and B on the same day. Now, for our sorcerer, the spells known are the end of the story. We don't have any worry about preparing spells, but that's not the case for every class. For a wizard or, let's say a druid or a cleric, they're going to have a much larger list of spells they know. In fact, the cleric and the druid are going to know every spell on their class's spell list, but they're going to have to prepare a fixed number of spells every morning. So it's a little more work for the player, but a little more versatile. You can kind of adjust to the kind of day you're going to have, or at least the kind of day you think you're going to have. But yeah, certain classes are going to have spells known and spells prepared, and those are distinct things. Another little extra wrinkle to the magic system of D&D. This sorcerer and bards and warlocks are not worried about preparing spells. They know what they know. All right, so let's get to the good stuff and let's look at a couple spells, and I'll walk you through what we're looking at. So let's go Healing Word. That's a popular one. That's a very good one to take along on your adventure. The first thing, big letters, it's going to say Healing Word, obviously. When you cast a spell as a player, you're typically going to want to announce what spell it is, because your Dungeon Master is going to need to know. So when you cast a spell, you say, I cast Healing Word. You can make it much more punchy and flavorful than that. But yeah, there you go. You title the spell, and that's how you go find it. Alphabetical order in the back of the PHB, the SRD, whatevs. Pretty simple. That next line is telling us it is first level. So right away we know we need a first level spell slot available in order to cast this. But skipping ahead a little bit, we can go down to the bottom and it says at higher levels, something else happens. So we can, fit this into a level 2 spell slot, a level 3 spell slot, and it's actually going to expand to fill that gauge and actually do more healing if we use a higher level spell slot. Beside first level there, it says evocation, and that is the School of Magic. There are 8 schools of magic in D&D. It's a kind of taxonomy, right? Every spell gets categorized, And it's interesting and it's definitely flavorful, and you can have some interesting arguments about, whether healing word actually belongs in evocation or necromancy. But mechanically, for the most part, it's not doing all that much. So I wouldn't get preoccupied with schools of magic. Again, it's certainly interesting. It can add a lot of flavor. And, in certain scenarios, certain wizards or what your wizard subclass is going to lean into certain schools of magic more. Certain like environments are going to have effects on illusory magic or whatever school of magic. Necromancy generally is considered evil, but if you're going to resurrect someone, you're using necromancy, right? Whatever. Again, it's a rich subject. If you want a whole video on schools of magic, let me know down below. But for this D&D 101, I'm going to tell you, don't worry too much about the school. Next line, we see casting time. And for healing word, it is a bonus action. So that means we can fire off a healing word easily enough, quickly enough, that during combat, it only takes a bonus action and we still have our action available to do something else. Now, in combat, per turn, you can only use one spell slot. So this healing word only takes up a bonus action, but uses our first level spell slot at least. So we wouldn't be able to cast any other spells that take up a spell slot. So that means we can cast a cantrip. We can cast a level 0 spell that doesn't use a spell slot. So we could cast Sacred Flame if we're a cleric and bonus healing word. We could also, bonus action cast healing word and dash or attack or take the help action or whatever else. Casting times can be much longer than a bonus action or an action. We can be looking at a minute, which would actually be 10 rounds of combat. And it can be much longer than that, 10 minutes, an hour, etc. And we're probably not doing those in combat. Next up, we have range, pretty self-explanatory, I think, in this case. We can heal anyone, including ourselves, within 60 feet of us. Now, some spells are going to be touch, meaning we have to be able to reach out and touch the target, be it an ally or an enemy. And some spells are going to be self, meaning we can only cast them on ourselves. Under components, we have a V, and that stands for verbal. That scans, right, for healing word. There is a verbal component to this spell. We have to say some magic words. So that means if we can't say those magic words, if there's a gag in our mouth or we're in a zone of magical silence or whatever else, then we won't be able to perform this spell. The last of those bold lines is duration. So healing word is instantaneous. It happens, it's over, that's it. Other spells can last for a round of combat, can last a minute, an hour, a day, even indefinitely. So after all that, we get a description of the spell itself and how it works. Important note on healing word, like a lot of spells, we have to be able to see the target. So if we've been blinded or we don't have line of sight, then we can't cast this spell, at least on that particular target. But assuming that we can see who we're trying to cast this on, they're going to get 1d4, a 4-sided die, plus our spellcasting modifier. Now, different classes are going to have different abilities getting drawn on for their spellcasting. So if this is the cleric, then they're going to use their wisdom. If it's the bard, they're going to use their charisma. But whatever that ability, core ability is for the caster, they're going to add that modifier to that d4 roll. Now that's at first level, the first level spell slot. If we cast this first level spell using a second level spell slot or a third level spell slot, one, maybe we've used up all our first level spells, or two, maybe our friend here needs that much more healing, we can upcast this spell, and that is going to make it more powerful. Our spell is going to fill the gauge of that third level spell, and it tells us right here what happens when we cast it at higher levels. If we do use that third level spell slot, then our ally here is going to get 3d4 plus our spellcasting modifiers worth of healing. Let's take a look at another popular first level spell. I made a find familiar joke about Dolly. I don't know if it's going to make the final cut, but she's been coming in and out of the room this whole time. So I'm going to show you the top, at least, of find familiar. Now, find familiar is paragraphs long, but let's take a look at the bold lines, at least for this example. So like I said, first level, find familiar happens to be conjuration. The school of conjuration is about like creating things, but more often summoning things, right? So if we want to summon a fey chihuahua, or we want to summon a demonic owl or an angelic weasel, whatever makes sense with your character, then yeah, conjuration's your school. It also covers like teleportation. Again, there's a whole video's worth of whatever information and nuance and debate about schools of magic. If you want to, let me know. But for D&D 101, we're not too worried about conjuration. But what we are interested in is that little parenthetical beside it that says ritual. So not every class has the ability to cast rituals, but if your character does, and the spell we're talking about has this ritual tag, that means we can spend an extra 10 minutes. On top of the duration, we can spend an additional 10 minutes casting the spell as a ritual and not expend a spell slot in the process. Pretty cool. In this example, the duration is an hour, so adding an additional 10 minutes to that in order to free up a spell slot for later doesn't feel like that much of a cost. Range on this one is 10 feet, so that's how far away our little, Fey Chihuahua can pop up. And then for components, we have VSM, and then parenthetically, a whole shopping list of stuff. So that V is for verbal again, there's some sort of spoken component to this spell, and then S is somatic. There is some sort of gesture involved as well. So in order to cast the spell, we need at least one freehand. And then that M is for material components, and the stuff in the parentheses is the physical stuff that we need in order to cast this spell. For a lot of spells, we can actually ignore the materials and replace them with a component pouch or an arcane focus holy symbol. It would be a shame because there's some real good flavor in leaning into using those materials, and there's actually some pretty clever jokes in there too if you're paying attention, but we can ignore those mechanically as long as they don't list a cost. So for Find Familiar, we need 10 gold pieces worth of incense and charcoal and herbs in order to cast this spell, and those resources are going to be consumed. We're going to burn them up in a brass brazier. So if we're going to cast this spell again, we need an additional 10 gold worth of material. Every time we cast this spell, we're going to be spending 10 gold, and we have to be able to procure this stuff. Let's pull up a second level spell. I'm going to go with Spike Growth. So in this example, you can see that the material components don't have a cost associated with them. So we can use whatever, the component pouch, the arcane focus, instead of having the stuff listed in the parentheses. Now again, I'll argue that it is pretty cool to have your character remove 7 thorny twigs from their pocket and whisper some magic words over them as they gesture with their fingers and make the ground before them erupt in spikes, catching the enemy unaware and slowing them down. Cool, but technically unnecessary. So for this one, you can see under duration, it says concentration 10 minutes. So the spell will last for 10 minutes as long as your character is concentrating on it. You can only concentrate on one spell at a time. So you can cast other spells while concentrating, but if you cast another spell that requires concentration, then this one will drop. Also, while concentrating on any spell, if you take damage, you're going to have to make a Constitution saving throw, and the DC is going to be 10 or half the amount of damage that you took, whichever is higher. So if you fail that Constitution saving throw, you lose the spell. Spike Growth is an area of effect spell. We're not shooting at a singular target. We are drawing a circle with a 20-foot radius anywhere within 150 feet of us. Now, page 276 of the Player's Handbook, and it's also on 102 of the system reference document, have a nice little explainer about like the different shapes and points of origin for area of effect spells. It's worth taking a look at that and getting a little better grasp of that, especially if you're loading up any of these spells. Like many area of effect AoE spells, the enemies have to make a save. Actually, in this case, it's a skill check, but it's the same core principle. They're going to be rolling, in this particular case, to notice that this happened to the ground if they weren't paying attention. So the DC, the difficulty class, the thing that they're trying to beat, is going to be 8 plus your proficiency bonus and your spell casting modifier. For many damage dealing spells, we're going to be the ones rolling to attack. So whether it's a ranged attack, right, like it's fire bolts, or it's a touch attack, it's like a melee spell attack, like Shocking Grasp, we are going to be rolling. our d20, and we're going to add our proficiency bonus and our spellcasting modifier, and that's going to go against the target's AC, the armor class. All right, so that about covers the basics for spellcasting in D&D. Now, there are particular things that you're going to have to know about your particular class and subclass, but even if you take two characters of the same class, even the same subclass, if you give those characters a different set of spells, then those characters are going to perform very differently. They're going to feel very different. And that's what we're discussing in the next video. Just a few ideas and like core principles to consider when you are building out your character's spell list. Until then, thank you so much for watching. Get out there, find your people, and play some D&D. Have a good time. Be kind. And again, thanks.